The first time Caleb Harrow laid eyes on Clara Devane, she was standing knee-deep in the Cimarron River with her skirts hiked up around her thighs, laughing at something her younger sister had said. And in that single, unguarded moment, the entire landscape of his life shifted beneath him like sand giving way to current. That was the spring of 1874, and Caleb had been riding the eastern boundary of his family's cattle land when her laughter carried across the water and stopped him cold. He was 23 years old, sun-darkened and lean, with hands that had known fence wire and rope and saddle leather since he was old enough to grip them. He was not the kind of man who stopped for things. He rode through dust storms and cold snaps and the low, hungry ache of loneliness that came with running a ranch on the Oklahoma prairie without a second thought, because stopping was something you did when you were done, and Caleb Harrow was never done. But he stopped that day. He pulled his roan mare, Della, to a slow halt at the crest of the low ridge that ran parallel to the river, and he just watched. The girl on the far bank was maybe 20, with dark auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and fallen in thick waves around her shoulders. Her face was turned up toward the sky in laughter, open and unself-conscious, and so terribly lovely that Caleb felt something in his chest crack open like dry earth after rain. The woman beside her, shorter and younger by a few years, was splashing water at her legs, and the auburn-haired one was twisting away from it with a shriek of delight that rang out across the Cimarron and reached him clean and bright as a bell. He did not know her name then. He did not know that she lived on the Devane homestead a mile and a half east of the river on the far side, that her father, Gerald Devane, was a stubborn and bitter man who had come from Missouri after the war with nothing but a mule and a grudge, and had somehow scratched 60 acres of decent farmland out of the Oklahoma territory. He did not know that she read books by lamplight until her eyes ached, that she could split a cord of wood in an afternoon and make a decent corn cake over an open fire, that she had been engaged once to a young man from Dodge City who had ridden off to chase silver in New Mexico and never come back, leaving her with nothing but a 2-line letter and a hollow place where certainty used to live. He did not know any of that yet. He only knew what the sunlight told him in that brief and blazing moment, that she was the most alive thing he had ever seen, and that he was on the wrong side of the river. The Cimarron was not an easy crossing in spring. The snowmelt had it running fast and deep through that stretch, and the nearest shallow ford was nearly 3 miles south. In practical terms, the river was nothing. He had crossed worse. But in the weeks that followed that first sighting, the river became something else entirely in Caleb's mind. It became a kind of measure, a test he had not yet found the courage to sit for. He told himself it was practical. He had cattle to move northward in the weeks after, fence posts to reset where the winter had heaved them, a leaking corner of the barn roof that needed re-shingling before the spring rains found it. There was always something, and every something was a reason to stay on his side of the water and do the sensible thing instead of riding 3 miles south to ford the river, and then 3 miles back north on the far bank, just to introduce himself to a woman who might have a husband for all he knew. But he came back to the ridge. That was the truth of it. In the evenings, when the work was wound down and the sky turned those impossible colors over the prairie, he would ride Della up to the high point of his eastern pasture and look across the river. Sometimes he saw nothing. Other times he saw smoke from the Devane chimney curling up into the gold air, and once he saw a figure in the kitchen garden at the back of the farmhouse, moving between the rows, and even at that distance he was certain it was her. He asked about her in town. Patience, the nearest settlement of any real size, sat 7 miles north on the old cattle trail and had a general store, a livery, a post office that doubled as a barber shop, and a saloon that doubled as the town meeting hall on the first Sunday of every month. Caleb rode in on a Wednesday in early May, ostensibly to pick up a sack of feed and a new draw chain for the well, and found himself steering the conversation with old Abe Cutter at the counter toward the Devane family. Abe had lived in the territory longer than almost anyone. He was a thin, white-whiskered man with oil-spotted fingers and a mind like a ledger book, and he told Caleb what he needed to know with the matter-of-fact generosity of a man who had long ago decided gossip was just information with better packaging. Devane, Gerald Devane runs that farm east of the Cimarron, yeah. Came up from Missouri, must be 10 years ago now. Wife passed 3 winters back, God rest her. He's got 2 daughters. The older one is Clara and the younger is Miriam. Clara'd be about 20 now, I reckon. Good woman, comes in every 2 weeks or so with eggs to trade. Quiet, reads a lot. He had paused there and squinted at Caleb. Why do you ask? Caleb had said something about a fence dispute and the property lying near the river and changed the subject quickly, but he rode home with Clara's name sitting warm in his chest like an ember. Clara. He turned it over in his mind all the way back to the ranch, and when he unsaddled Della and gave her her evening measure of oats, he said it aloud once, quietly in the empty barn, just to hear what it sounded like in the air. It sounded like something he had been waiting to say without knowing it. Through that first summer, he told himself he was simply giving the situation time to ripen, which was the kind of lie that sounds almost reasonable if you say it often enough. The truth was simpler and harder. Caleb Harrow was afraid. Not of the river, not of the distance, not even of Gerald Devane, who had a reputation for being unpleasant to strangers. He was afraid of the particular nakedness of crossing over and being seen and being found lacking. He had built his ranch himself, had poured 3 years of relentless work into the land his father had left him, and he was proud of what he had made. But pride and worth were not the same thing, and standing before a woman whose laughter could stop a man at 100 yards and saying, "Here I am. I have been watching you from the other side of the river, and I could not stop thinking about you," that required a kind of courage that fence posts and cattle drives did not demand. So he watched. He learned her rhythms from across the water. She came to the river on Tuesday and Friday mornings to do the washing, spreading the clothes over the low willow branches to dry while she worked, and she always worked fast and with a concentrated economy of motion that he found beautiful in a way he could not fully articulate. She had a habit of pushing her hair back from her face with her forearm when her hands were wet, and she sometimes sang while she worked, not loud enough that he could make out the words, but loud enough that the melody reached him if the wind was right, and he sat those mornings on the ridge with his hat in his hands and let it reach him. He saw her father twice from across the river, a stocky gray-haired man who moved with the purposeful irritability of someone perpetually at war with something. He saw Miriam often, running down to the bank on warm afternoons to swim or fish, a small, quick-moving girl with her older sisters coloring and twice the noise. He watched Clara chase Miriam back from the deep water once, laughing and scolding in equal measure, and something about the tenderness of it made his throat tight. He was in love. He knew it the way you know a change in weather, not because of any single thing but because of the accumulated weight of all the small signs. He had never been in love before, not truly, and the experience was not what the songs made it sound like. It was not soft or easy. It was a persistent ache, a sharp awareness, a constant low-grade dissatisfaction with the distance between himself and the source of everything that suddenly seemed to matter. Summer turned to fall and the river ran lower, and Caleb found himself standing at its edge one warm September evening with his boots in his hand, staring at the far bank. He could have crossed it then. It was barely thigh-deep at that point, the current slow and quiet. He stood there for a long time in the cooling air with the cottonwood leaves going gold around him, and then he put his boots back on and went home. He was not ready, or he was afraid. They were, he suspected, the same thing. The fall harvest kept him busy enough that he could pretend to himself. He simply did not have time, which was partially true. He had 30 head of cattle to drive to the patients holding pens for the fall buyer, and the late corn needed cutting, and one of his fence lines along the north pasture had been cut by someone passing through who needed a shortcut and did not much care who owned the land. He fixed the fence himself. 3 days of hard work in the October cold with his breath steaming in front of him, and he thought about Clara Devane the whole time. He thought about what he would say. He rehearsed it the way a schoolboy rehearses a recitation, lying awake in his bunk with the prairie wind leaning against the walls of the cabin and the fire burning low. He thought about riding up to the Devane gate on a good morning and asking to speak with her father first, because that was the proper way of things in 1874, and Gerald Devane was a man who would care about the proper way. He thought about what he would say to explain himself, how he would lay out the ranch, the acreage, the cattle count, the water rights, as though love were a ledger that could be balanced. And then he would think about Clara herself, about the way she laughed, about the sound of her singing carried on the wind, and all the careful words he had assembled would scatter like sparrows, and he would be left with nothing but the clean, hard, wordless fact of how much he felt, which was not something you could put in a ledger. Winter came down hard in November, the way it sometimes did in the Oklahoma Territory, with a blue norther that swept in off the plains and drove the temperature down 30 degrees in an afternoon. The river iced over along its shallower edges, and Caleb watched from the ridge one gray afternoon as a thin, dark figure moved along the far bank, breaking ice away from the water's edge with a long stick, probably keeping the watering hole open for their animals. He was nearly certain it was Clara. He raised his hand across the distance in a gesture that was half wave and half something he had no name for. She did not see him, or if she did, she gave no sign. He spent the winter working on the cabin. It had been livable since he built it, but livable and good were not the same thing, and somewhere around the 3rd week of December, he had started expanding the back room and adding a proper stone fireplace to replace the old iron stove. He told his neighbor and closest friend, a broad-shouldered Texan named Owen Briggs who ran a small spread 2 miles to the west, that he was doing it for the cold. Owen had looked at the new window frames Caleb had cut and glazed, and said with the slow certainty of a man who had known Caleb for 5 years, that he was not doing it for the cold. "You are building a house for someone," Owen said, sitting on a stump with his coffee watching Caleb set window glass with careful hands. "I am improving my property. You replaced the curtain rod in the bedroom. The old one was rusted. You put up a second curtain rod." Caleb had kept his eyes on the glass and said nothing, and Owen had laughed, a warm, rolling sound that rose in the cold air and faded into the wind. "Who is she?" Owen asked. "Nobody. Nobody does not get curtain rods." Caleb had told him then, not all of it, but enough. He had told him about the ridge and the river and the auburn-haired woman who came to the Cimarron on Tuesday and Friday mornings, and about the 3 seasons he had spent on the wrong side of the water. Owen had listened with the grave attentiveness of a man hearing a confession, and when Caleb was finished, he had set down his coffee cup on his knee and looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "Caleb," he said finally, "you are the best cattleman in 3 counties and the biggest fool in the territory. Cross the river. It is not that simple. You swam across a flooding river in '68 to pull a calf out of a cottonwood tangle. That was a calf. And this is a woman, which makes it more important, not less." Owen had picked up his coffee again with an air of finality. "Cross the river, Caleb, before somebody else does." That last sentence had landed differently than Owen intended. Before somebody else does. Caleb had not considered it from that angle, not truly, not in the way that made his stomach drop. He had been so occupied with his own hesitation that he had not stopped to think about what might be happening on the far bank during the time he spent watching and waiting and building curtain rods for nobody. He thought about it all through the rest of that winter. He thought about it while he mended tack by firelight, and while he broke ice on the stock trough in the blue January mornings, and while he lay awake listening to the wind work its way under the eaves. He thought about it until the thinking became a kind of low fever that he carried into the first weeks of spring. The second spring came, and the Cimarron ran high again with snowmelt, and Caleb rode the ridge and watched and still did not cross. But something had changed. He had made a decision, somewhere in the bone-deep cold of that second winter, that was not yet an action but was something firmer than a wish. He was going to cross. He was simply waiting for the moment to announce itself, because the moments that mattered, he had always believed, did not need to be forced. They arrived when the conditions were right, like good weather or a clean shot. He did not know that the moment would be forced upon him by circumstances that had nothing to do with his readiness. It was a Tuesday in late April, a morning warm enough to suggest summer without fully committing to it, and Caleb was at the ridge in the early hour as he so often was, watching the far bank of the Cimarron go gold in the rising light. He had brought coffee in a tin cup, one of his small rituals, and he was sitting on Della's back with his cup in both hands and the steam rising around his face when he saw Clara come down to the river to do the washing. She had her basket and her washboard, and she set up at her usual spot, the flat stones near the bend where the water eddied into a quiet pool below the main current. He watched her work with the familiar ache he had come to think of as his natural resting state, and everything was as it always was, except that after about 20 minutes he noticed she had stopped working. She was standing with her hands on the washboard and her head down, and she was not moving. Not the still of someone resting, but the still of someone trying very hard to hold something together. He watched for another minute, uncertain, and then she sat down on the flat stone beside the pool with her knees pulled up and her face in her hands, and even at that distance and across a river in spring flood, he could see her shoulders moving with the rhythm of crying. Something took over in Caleb then that had no language in it, only direction. He wheeled Della south and put his heels to her, and they went at a hard run down the ridge line toward the ford 3 miles south, and Caleb did not think about what he was doing, or what he would say, or whether the moment was right, because all of that had stopped mattering. The only thing that mattered was that she was sitting on a rock on the other side of the river crying, and he was on the wrong side of it. The ford was shallow, even in April with the water up, only chest-high on Della at the deepest point, and they crossed it in 3 minutes, the cold water soaking Caleb's legs to the thigh, and then he was on the eastern bank for the first time in the better part of 2 years, riding north along the tree line at a canter, the wet leather of his saddle creaking and his heart going at a pace that had nothing to do with the ride. He came around the bend, and she was still sitting on the flat stone. She heard Della's hoofbeats on the soft bank and looked up with a startled expression, and for a moment neither of them moved. He brought Della to a stop about 15 feet from her and looked at her. She was lovelier up close than the distance had allowed him to see. Her eyes were reddened from crying, dark brown with flecks of amber in them, and her face was still wet, and she was looking at him with an expression he could not quite read, somewhere between confusion and wariness and something else that he did not yet have the right to name. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I did not mean to startle you." She looked at him for a moment, then wiped her face with the back of her hand. "You are from the other side," she said. It was not a question. He blinked. "Pardon?" "The west bank." She tilted her head slightly. "I have seen you on the ridge." Most mornings for a good while now. The heat that rose up the back of his neck and into his face was swift and absolute, and he had no defense against it. He thought about lying, considered it seriously for about 2 seconds, and then discarded it because he was 24 years old and he had never been worth a damn as a liar. "Yes," he said simply. She studied him with those amber-flecked eyes, and he endured it. "And you chose today to cross," she said. "You were crying." Something shifted in her expression, the wariness softened by a fraction. "That is a reason to cross a river for a stranger." "I did not think about whether it was a reason," he said. "I just crossed." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she looked out at the water, and he could see her working through something internal, some calculation or decision. He stayed where he was, still in the saddle, not wanting to crowd her. "My name is Caleb Harrow," he said. "I run the cattle ranch on the west bank, the Harrow place. My father built it and I have been working it for 3 years. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Clara Devane. I know, he said, and immediately wished he had not, because it sounded strange without the context of Abe Cutter and the general store, which he was not about to explain. She gave him a look that suggested she found this slightly alarming. You know my name. I asked about you in Patience at the general store. He made himself hold her gaze. I am not going to pretend I did not. Clara Devane looked at him for a moment, and then something unexpected happened. She almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but the corner of her mouth moved just barely, and it was enough to make his heart do something unreliable. Abe Cutter, she said. Yes. He mentioned you had questions about the Devane family. Caleb stared at her. He told you that. He tells everyone everything. He has the memory of a courthouse clerk and the discretion of a town crier. Now she did smile, just briefly, and it was like watching a lamp come on in a dark room. But then the smile faded and she looked back at the water, and whatever had been making her cry before he arrived came back into her face. He could see it settle on her like a weight. You do not have to tell me, he said quietly. I will ride back across if you want me to. She was quiet for a moment. Then she shook her head, a small motion. My father is unwell, she said. He has been coughing since February, and he will not see the doctor in Patience because he says we cannot afford it, which is true, and because he says it is nothing, which I do not believe. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at them. He was out at the field at first light this morning, and I found blood on his handkerchief in the wash, and I did not know what to do with that, so I came down here. Caleb climbed down from Della and looped her reins around a willow branch and walked to the flat stone and sat down beside her, not close, but close enough to be present. He had not planned to do it. He simply did it. I am sorry about your father, he said. He is proud, she said. He will not accept help, and he will not spend what money we have on himself, and Miriam is only 17, and I do not know what we would do if she stopped. Took a breath. I am sorry. You are a stranger. You said that already. She looked at him with those remarkable eyes. It is still true. It is, he agreed. But strangers have been known to become something else. There was a long silence between them, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that has room in it. The river moved past them with its steady conversation, and a red-tailed hawk made a slow circle over the far bank, and a pair of killdeer called from somewhere in the willows downstream. Why were you on the ridge? She asked finally. He thought about giving her a gentle version. He was not good at gentle versions. Because I could see you from there, he said. And I did not want to stop being able to. Clara Devane turned and looked at him fully, and he met her gaze without flinching, because he had made his crossing, and there was no going back to the comfortable side of the water. The redness around her eyes from the crying made them look even more vivid, and she was looking at him with an expression that was cautious but not closed, curious but not yet trusting, and it was the most honest face he had ever seen in his life. You should have crossed sooner, she said quietly. I know, he said. I was being a fool. You were, she agreed, with the ghost of that smile returning. They sat by the river for another hour that morning. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle, about his father who had died of a fever when Caleb was 19 and left him the land and a good saddle, and the kind of grief that takes years to work through, but makes you stronger in the places it knits back together. She told him about her mother, who had been a school teacher from Ohio and had brought a crate of books west with her that was still in the corner of the farmhouse parlor, and about how Clara had read all of them twice and some of them 3 times. She told him about the young man from Dodge City who had gone to New Mexico without her, and she said it plainly, without self-pity, as though it were simply information. He walked her back to the path that led up from the river to the Devane farmhouse, and she stopped at the foot of it and turned to look at him with her washing basket over her arm. Thank you, she said, for crossing. I should have done it a long time ago, he said. Next time, she said, with a deliberateness that made his heart lift, you will not have to wait for me to be crying. He rode back to the ford with the warm April sun on his face and the sound of her voice still in his ears. And when he crossed the Cimarron and climbed the west bank and turned Della toward home, he felt so thoroughly changed that he expected the landscape to look different. It looked exactly the same, which seemed impossible. He was back at the ford 3 days later on a Friday, because she had said Friday mornings she did the washing and he was not going to waste the intelligence. He crossed before she arrived and sat on the flat stone with his hat in his hands and waited, and when she came around the bend with her basket and her washboard and saw him sitting there, she stopped for just a moment, and then she set her basket down and said, "You learned to cross." "I had a good reason," he said. She set up her washing and he sat nearby and they talked for 2 hours. He learned that she could name every plant that grew along the Cimarron bank by its common name and half of them by their scientific names, because her mother's books included a botanical guide that she had memorized the way other girls memorized hymns. He learned that she thought the territorial government in Guthrie was doing a poor job of protecting settler land rights and had firm opinions about it, which she articulated with a precision and heat that made him laugh with delight. He learned that she had a gift for mimicry and could reproduce the exact cadence and tone of Abe Cutter's voice so accurately that Caleb nearly choked on his water. She learned that he could do the kind of mental arithmetic that other men needed paper for, that he had been trying without success for 2 years to teach himself to play the harmonica, and that he was afraid of nothing in the natural world except, apparently, women who stood knee-deep in rivers in April and laughed at things. She had gone very still at that last confession. Then she had said, "That is the most peculiar thing I have ever heard from a man your size." "I am aware," he said. She looked at him with those amber-flecked eyes warm and wondering. "I was laughing at Miriam," she said. "She had just told me a joke about a traveling preacher that was entirely unsuitable for mixed company. I know that now, but you did not know it then." "No, I only knew you were laughing and that I wanted to be the reason for it." The words had come out before he had fully decided to say them. He watched her face carefully. She did not look away. She looked back at him steadily with something in her expression that was new, something softer and more open than the caution of their first meeting, and she said nothing for a moment. And then she picked up her washing and went back to work. But there was something different in the set of her shoulders now, and when she pushed her hair back from her face with her forearm in the way he had watched from 100 yards for 2 years, she glanced over at him and she was almost smiling. He began to call on the Devane farm properly. He spoke to Gerald Devane on a Thursday afternoon in early May, sitting across from the man at the kitchen table in a farmhouse that smelled of wood smoke and cornmeal and old wool, and he laid it out honestly. He was a neighbor, and he had come to know Clara by the river, and he would like to pay his respects properly. Gerald Devane was not a warm man. He had a blunt, weathered face and eyes that seemed permanently narrowed against some offense either atmospheric or social, and he looked at Caleb for a long time before he said anything. "Harrow," he said, "West Bank." "Yes, sir. I know your land, good water rights, good grass on the southern quarter. Thank you. You run it alone." "I do." Gerald Devane looked at him in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "My daughter is not a prize or a convenience. She has a mind of her own, and she will always have a mind of her own, and any man who thinks that is something to be changed will find himself corrected on that point very directly." "I do not think that," Caleb said, with more feeling than was perhaps entirely dignified. Gerald had grunted. It was not exactly approval, but it was the absence of refusal, which Caleb decided was close enough. He saw the blood on the old man's cough cloth when Gerald stepped outside and Caleb passed the window. He did not say anything that day, but on his way back to the ford he made a decision. He rode to Patience the next morning and spoke to Doc Reeves, the territory's nearest physician, who operated out of a back room above the livery stable and charged what he could and forgave what he couldn't. He paid the man's retainer from his own pocket and arranged for a house call to the Devane farm, without telling Gerald Devane or Clara that he had done so, because he knew Gerald would refuse and Clara would be made uncomfortable by the charity of it, and he did not want it to be a point of complication between them when they were only just beginning. Doc Reeves rode out the following week. He told Caleb afterward, quietly, and with the gravity of a man carrying difficult information, that Gerald Devane had a deep infection of the lungs, treatable if the man was willing to rest and take the medicines, which he doubted, but possible. He said he had told Clara, because she had asked him directly, and she deserved to know. Clara found out about Caleb's arrangement with Doc Reeves on a warm Friday morning in late May, sitting on the flat stone by the river where they had first spoken. He had not meant to tell her. She had asked him how it had come about that Doc Reeves had arrived without being sent for, and he had seen in her eyes that she already had a suspicion, and he had made a decision not to lie to her. She was quiet for a long time after he told her. The river moved between them and the cottonwoods, and the warm spring air and the killdeer in the willows were all exactly as they always were, and Caleb sat and waited for whatever was coming. "You paid for the doctor," she said. "Yes." "Without telling us." "Your father would not have allowed it. He still might not allow the treatment. I know, but at least now he knows what is wrong." Another long silence. He watched her face and could not fully read it, which was rare for him now. He was learning her expressions the way you learn a landscape, slowly and with real attention until the landmarks become familiar. This one was new. "Why?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that was not quite steady. He looked at her. "Because he is your father and you love him," he said simply. "And because he stopped." He had been about to say something large, and he was not sure the moment was ready for it. He said instead, "Because it was the right thing to do." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she reached over and put her hand on his, just briefly, just for a second, a light sure pressure of her fingers against his knuckles, and then she took her hand back and looked at the river, and Caleb sat very still and looked at the river too and tried to remember how to breathe. Through the summer of 1875, they built something together that neither of them called by its name for a long time, out of mutual stubbornness, and also out of a kind of shared respect for the weight of the thing, and a reluctance to cheapen it with premature naming. They met at the river twice a week on the established days, and in June he began calling at the farmhouse on Sunday afternoons as well, bringing small useful things each time. A coil of good rope, a jar of the rendered beeswax that was good for waterproofing boots, a book he had ordered from a catalog that he thought she would like, a collection of essays by a woman naturalist that the man at the general store had looked at dubiously before handing it over. She read the book in 3 days and brought it back to him the following Sunday with 12 pages of notes written in the narrow margins in her small, sharp handwriting. And when he read her notes later that night by lamplight, he thought that he had never encountered a mind like hers in his life, and that the Cimarron River had never been wide enough to have kept him from it for as long as it did. He met Miriam properly in June. The younger Devane sister, who was nothing like her reputation for loudness, had led him to expect, or rather she was exactly that loud but with an additional quality of sharp, observant intelligence that he had not anticipated. Miriam was 17 and all energy, with the same auburn hair as Clara and their father's bluntness, and she decided within approximately 5 minutes of their first meeting that she liked him, which she expressed by subjecting him to 40 minutes of interrogation about cattle management and water rights before abruptly asking him if he was in love with her sister. Caleb had looked at Miriam Devane across the kitchen table with what he hoped was a dignified expression and said that he had the highest regard for Clara. Miriam had said, "That is not what I asked." He had said, "No, I suppose it is not." Miriam had studied him for a moment with those sharp young eyes. "She talks about you," she said. "She does not talk about people. She does not talk about anything that does not grow in the ground or come out of a book mostly. But she talks about you." Caleb had gone home that evening feeling as though something that had been wound tight inside him for 2 years had loosened by a single critical notch. Gerald Devane's health improved slowly through the summer, with Doc Reeves's medicines and Clara's vigilant management of his rest and what he ate and how much he worked. The old man was grudging about all of it, and complained in the specific, exhausted way of men who know they are being kept alive by the determination of someone who loves them, and resent the obligation even as they depend on it. He was gruff to Caleb, consistently and without particular malice, the way a man is gruff to someone he is not yet sure of, but has not yet found reason to reject. Caleb helped with the harvest in August, arriving at the Devane farm before dawn and working alongside Gerald and the neighboring families who came to help with the corn, the same neighborly exchange of labor that all the small farms in the territory depended on. And at the end of the day, when the women set out the harvest supper on long tables under the oaks, he sat beside Clara in the fading light, and their arms touched, and neither of them moved away. And he thought that happiness was sometimes very simple and very close. He told her how he felt on an evening in early September, when the air had the first thin cold of fall in it, and the cottonwoods were going gold, and they were sitting on the flat stone by the Cimarron after he had walked her back from a trip to Patience, where she had picked up the family's post, and he had met her by chance outside the general store. He had not planned to say it that evening. He had not planned to say it out loud at all for another few weeks, pending what he had decided to present to her father. But they were sitting in the quiet of the early evening with the golden light on the water, and she was telling him about a letter from a school friend in Kansas City who had invited her to visit, and she had said, "I thought about going. For a while I thought I might like to go somewhere quite different." And she had paused and looked at the river, and then she had said, "But I could not think of a reason to leave now that I had a reason to stay." The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that requires something. "Clara," he said, "yes, I have been in love with you since the first morning I saw you in this river." She turned and looked at him. The light was low and golden, and it found the amber in her eyes, and he looked back at her steadily and without flinching, because this was what he had ridden 3 miles south to ford a cold river in April to get to, and he was not going to look away from it now. "You had not spoken to me yet," she said. "On that morning. I know. You did not know me. No, I knew your laugh, and I knew that I needed to know the rest of you." She was quiet for a moment, and the river went on past them with its steady, patient voice. Then she said, very quietly, "It took you a long time to cross." "It did," he said. "I am sorry for that." "Do not be sorry," she said. "Just do not take so long again." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat by the Cimarron in the September evening with their hands folded together, and the golden light going and the geese going over high and fast above them. And he thought that the river, the patient and indifferent river that had been between them for 3 seasons, was now simply a river again, which was all it had ever actually been. He spoke to Gerald Devane the following Saturday morning. He put on his good shirt and rode Della over at a respectable hour with his hat in his hand, and sat down across from the old man in the kitchen, and told him that he intended, with Clara's consent and with Gerald's blessing, to ask Clara to marry him. He told him about the ranch, the acreage and the cattle count and the water rights, as he had always known he would. He told him that the cabin was good and warm, and he had spent the previous winter improving it, and it had room for a family. He told him that he was 25 years old and in good health, and that he had no debt and no enemies and no habits that he would be ashamed for a father-in-law to know about. Gerald Devane listened to all of it with his arms crossed over his chest, and his eyes doing that perpetual narrowing thing, and his chest making the thick sound that had been in it all summer, less bad now but still present. When Caleb finished, Gerald was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She will have opinions." "I count on it," Caleb said. "She will argue with you." "Good. I need someone to argue with who is smarter than me." Gerald looked at him. Something in the old man's face shifted, some long-held tension releasing by a fraction. "She will not give up her books," he said. "I would not ask her to. She will teach her children to read as young as they can hold a page." "I hope she will." Another long silence. Outside, a horse moved in the yard. Somewhere in the house, Miriam was singing something off-key and cheerful. You kept my doctor bill, Gerald said finally. Caleb had not expected that. He said nothing. Abe Cutter told me, Gerald said with a faint and distinctly sardonic look. Abe Cutter tells everyone everything. I know, Caleb said. I know that now. Gerald looked at him for another moment. Then he unfolded his arms and put his hands on his knees and said, with the air of a man making a statement he has been working toward for some time, my daughter deserves a man who crosses rivers. I believe you have proved yourself one. He extended his hand across the table. Caleb shook it. He found Clara in the kitchen garden at the back of the house, where she was gathering the last of the late herbs before the first hard frost came and took them. She was bent over the rosemary with her sleeves rolled back and her hair pinned up under a cloth, and she looked up when she heard his footsteps on the dry ground, and something in his face must have told her something, because she straightened slowly and looked at him with an expression that was very still and very attentive. He did not have a ring. He had thought about ordering one from the catalog in patience, but had decided that he would rather find one in person, because a ring for Clara Devane ought to be chosen with care and not guessed at from a line drawing in a catalog. He had planned to ask the question, and then they would go together to choose the ring, which he thought she might prefer in any case, because she was not a woman who liked other people making choices on her behalf. He stood at the edge of the kitchen garden with his hat in his hand and the dry September air moving around them and said, Clara, I know, she said softly. You know what I am going to say. I have known for some time what you were building up to, a small smile. You are not as difficult to read as you think you are, Caleb Harrow. Then you know my question. She looked at him across the rosemary and the late sage and the dry stems of the summer's basil with those dark, amber-flecked, entirely extraordinary eyes. Ask it properly, she said. He stepped around the garden bed and came to stand in front of her and took both her hands in his. And they were cool from the earth, and they fit in his hands the way something fits when it was always meant to. He looked at her face, at this face that had been the landscape of his longing for 3 full seasons, and he said simply and completely, Clara Devane, I love you. I have loved you from across the river for 3 seasons, and I have been a fool for every moment of it because you were there, and I was there, and the river was never the obstacle I thought it was. I want to be your husband if you will have me. I want to build a life with you. I want to sit across from your father's glare at supper and argue with you about books and grow old on the West Bank with you beside me. Will you marry me? Clara Devane looked at him for a moment that lasted long enough to be counted in heartbeats. Yes, she said. I will. He kissed her there in the kitchen garden with the dry herbs around their feet and the September sky going blue above them and the faint cold coming. And it was the first time their lips had met, and it was not tentative or practiced. It was simply right. The way the river ford in spring is right when you know the crossing and you have done it before. They were married in November of 1875, in the small church in Patience that served 4 townships, and had a minister who rode a circuit on a gray mule and arrived, as always, 15 minutes late. The church was too cold and the windows let in a draft, and there were only about 30 people in attendance, which was most of the town and half the surrounding settlers. And Owen Briggs stood up with Caleb, and Miriam stood up with Clara, and Gerald Devane sat in the front pew with his hands on his knees, and his face doing something that was not quite a smile, but was definitely in the same family. Caleb had ordered the ring from a jeweler in Dodge City after all, because he had written to describe what he wanted, which was something simple and honest without unnecessary ornamentation, and the jeweler had sent back a plain gold band with a small garnet set into it, the color of river water in October. And when he put it on Clara's finger in the cold little church and felt her hand steady and certain under his, he thought he had never been so exactly where he was supposed to be. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon in the early afternoon with the winter sun low and pale, and the grass silver with frost on either side of the track. And when they crossed the ford of the Cimarron, the water was low and cold, and the wagon went through it smoothly, the wheels barely splashing, and Clara looked out at the river with her head against his shoulder and said nothing, and he pressed his lips briefly to her hair and said nothing either, because there was nothing left to say about the river. They had said it all by crossing. The first winter of their marriage was the best winter of Caleb's life, which he acknowledged privately was a low bar given that his previous winters had been characterized primarily by solitude and functional competence. But this was different in a way that was not about comfort or warmth, though the cabin was warm with the new stone fireplace burning good oak, and the curtain rods earning their keep against the blue northern drafts. It was different because he came home to someone, and she came home to him, and the evenings that had previously been functional and quiet were now full of her. Her voice reading aloud from the books on the shelf, her opinions on everything from land management to the territorial legislature delivered with cheerful ferocity, her laughter at his harmonica attempts, which were still terrible, her hand finding his across the supper table. She brought her mother's crate of books from the Devane farmhouse in December, Miriam helping to carry it across the ford in the shallow cold water with their skirts wet to the knee and both of them laughing. And Caleb built a proper shelf for them along the east wall of the parlor where the firelight would reach them. Clara arranged them herself and spent an evening going through each one with the absorbed tenderness of a person reacquainting themselves with old friends. And he sat in the chair by the fire and watched her, and felt something so large and quiet inside him that he had no word for it. Or rather, he had the word, but it seemed too small for the thing. Gerald Devane's health continued to be a matter of careful management through that winter. Doc Reeves came out twice more, and his prognosis was cautious but improved, and by February the old man's color was better and the coughing less continuous. He was still stubborn about his rest and still grudgingly tolerant of Caleb's existence, but in January he had accepted, without comment, the cord of split wood that Caleb had stacked against the east wall of the Devane farmhouse, and in the Wild West that was basically a declaration of goodwill. Clara rode over to see her father twice a week and stayed to help Miriam with the heavier household work, and Caleb sometimes went with her on Sundays, sitting at Gerald Devane's table and discussing cattle prices and weather patterns with the old man, who was, beneath his bristle and grudge, genuinely knowledgeable about farming the Oklahoma Territory, and had a dry, sharp wit that appeared very rarely and disappeared quickly, like a hawk over water. In the spring of 1876, Caleb expanded the cattle operation. He bought 20 additional head at the spring market in Patience, a negotiation that involved 2 days of methodical back and forth with a seller from Texas who had a hard face and harder numbers, and he came out of it with better than he had hoped. Owen Briggs helped him drive the new cattle to the west pasture, and they worked through 2 long days with the spring air sharp and the new grass greening up along the low ground. And in the evenings Owen came to the cabin for supper and Clara fed them both and listened to them argue about fencing strategies with her chin in her hand and her eyes bright. "She thinks we are both wrong," Caleb told Owen. "I am aware," Owen said, looking at Clara. "You are thinking we are both wrong." "About the north fence line, yes," Clara said pleasantly. "The issue is not the length or the wire gauge. The issue is the post depth. Clay soil on the north quarter heaves in the freeze cycle. You need posts 3 feet minimum to hold through a hard winter." Owen Briggs looked at Caleb, then back at Clara. "She is right," he said. "She usually is," Caleb said. Owen went home that night telling everyone in Patience that Caleb Harrow had married someone considerably smarter than himself, which was not untrue and not unkind. That summer, Clara told him she was expecting. She told him on a July morning when the heat was already thick by 8 and they were sitting at the breakfast table, and she said it very directly, which was how she said everything, and then she watched his face. He sat with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth for about 3 seconds, and then he put it down very carefully on the table and looked at her. "Clara," he said. "Yes. Are you well?" "I am very well. I am tired in the mornings and I have opinions about smells, but I am otherwise well." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat there in the July morning with the heat coming and the future coming, and everything that had seemed fixed and sufficient suddenly expanding into something larger and wilder and more astonishing than he had the framework to contain. "A child," he said. "Yes." She squeezed his hand. Her eyes were warm and steady. "Around February, I believe." He thought about February on the Oklahoma prairie, about the cold and the wind and the spare flat distances, and then he thought about a child, his and Clara's child, and the February cold seemed of entirely manageable significance. "I will be ready," he said. She smiled, that full open lamp-in-a-dark-room smile. "I know you will," she said. "You crossed the Cimarron in spring flood when you barely knew my name. I expect you can handle this." Their son was born in February of 1877, in the back room of the cabin that Caleb had built and improved and built again, in the warmest part of the house with the stone fireplace going and the wind outside and Doc Reeves in attendance. It was a long night, and Caleb spent most of it on the wrong side of the bedroom door, which he found significantly harder than any river crossing he had ever made, because at least in a river, he had something to do with his hands and his body, and the waiting was directional. This waiting was simply waiting. When Doc Reeves opened the door and told him, Caleb went into the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside Clara, who was exhausted and pale and brilliant, and he looked at the child in her arms, a red-faced, dark-haired, entirely miniature and entirely overwhelming person, and he did not say anything for a long time. "A boy," Clara said softly. "A boy," he repeated. His voice had done something unreliable. He cleared his throat. "Hold him," she said. He took the child with the careful, deliberate hands of a man who has spent his life handling things that require care, and found that his hands knew what to do without his having to instruct them, as though some portion of himself had been practicing for this without telling him. The child was warm and solid and impossibly small, and his eyes, when they briefly opened, were dark and unfocused and ancient, looking in the way of all newborns. "Thomas," Clara said. "I thought Thomas." "Thomas," Caleb said, and looked at his son, and felt the Cimarron, the ridge, the 3 seasons of watching and waiting and not crossing, the April morning and the flat stone and her face with the crying red around her eyes, and all the Tuesdays and Fridays and the kitchen garden and the November church and the January wood and Owen Briggs at the supper table, and every single moment of the past 3 years compress into this one, into this room, into this. And he thought that the river had been worth crossing. He went to tell Caleb Devane himself that same morning, riding through the February cold with his coat pulled up and his breath steaming, and when the old man came to the door in his nightshirt and Caleb told him he had a grandson, something happened to Caleb Devane's face that Caleb had never seen before and suspected very few people ever had. It opened. Just for a moment, just long enough, it opened entirely. "A boy," Caleb said. "A boy, Clara as well. They are both well." Caleb Devane looked at him for a moment, and then he nodded once, a short firm nod, and said, "Good man," and went inside to get dressed. He was at the cabin within the hour, sitting by Clara's bedside with his grandson in his arms, and an expression of such naked tenderness that Caleb had to go out to the barn for a few minutes to give the old man his privacy with it. Miriam arrived an hour after that, having ridden over from the farmhouse at a pace that Caleb noted was not safe in February on a cold, stiffened horse, but had sense enough not to mention, and she burst through the cabin door with her hair undone and her cheeks wind-burned and went directly to Clara and kissed her on the forehead, and then looked at Thomas with enormous eyes. "He is very small," Miriam said. "He was just born," Clara said, with the patient amusement of someone explaining the obvious. "He looks like Caleb. He does not look like anyone yet. He looks like a person who is very recently arrived. He has Caleb's nose." Caleb, from the doorway, said nothing, because he was not entirely sure he could manage anything that would not embarrass him. Thomas Harrow grew through his first year with the focused energy of something that has been waiting to happen, bright-eyed and loud and fascinated by everything, and the cabin that Caleb had built and rebuilt filled with the particular warm chaos of a household that has a child in it. The books were rearranged to higher shelves. The fireplace irons were moved to a shelf. Clara read to Thomas in the evenings, starting before he could possibly understand the words, because she said it was not too early and she was right, as she tended to be. Miriam turned 18 in the summer of 1877 and came to the ranch for a month to help Clara in the last of the summer heat with Thomas. And it was during this month that Owen Briggs, who had been finding various plausible reasons to visit the Harrow Ranch with increasing frequency, appeared to lose all capacity for ordinary conversation in Miriam Devane's presence. He would arrive with a question about fence posts or cattle prices and find Miriam in the yard with Thomas on her hip, and he would simply stop, in the middle of whatever sentence he had begun, and reassemble himself visibly before continuing. Caleb said nothing. Clara said nothing. They sat on the porch in the evenings and watched Owen Briggs rediscover the English language each time Miriam walked into his field of vision, and they looked at each other with the same expression, which was one of deep warmth and the specific amusement of people who recognize something from the inside. "You should tell him," Clara said one evening. "Tell him what?" "That it helps to cross the river," she said. "Whatever his river is." Caleb looked at his wife in the evening light, at her auburn hair and her amber-flecked eyes and the lamplight behind her from the cabin window, and he laughed, low and warm and full. "I will tell him," he said. He did tell Owen the following week, walking the south fence line together. He told him plainly that the waiting was the wrong thing, that whatever was stopping him from saying the obvious thing to Miriam Devane was in his own head and nowhere else, and that the river, whatever form it took for him, was never as wide as it looked from the wrong side. Owen Briggs listened to this and then said, "You are going to tell this story forever." "Probably," Caleb said. Owen looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "She is 17 years younger than me. She is 18, and you are not 50, you are 31, 13 years. Owen." "I know," Owen said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out across the south pasture at the cattle moving in the slow gold afternoon. "I know." "Then do something about it," Caleb said. "Do not wait 3 seasons, for the love of God." Owen did not wait 3 seasons. He rode to the Devane farmhouse the following Sunday after church and spoke to Gerald, who received this news with the same crossed arms, narrowed-eyes gravity with which he had received everything, and then said the same thing he had said to Caleb, that Miriam had a mind of her own and it would stay that way, and that he had better know what he was getting into. Owen said he was counting on it. He asked Miriam that same afternoon, and she said yes with such immediate and unsurprised definitiveness that Owen came back to tell Caleb, looking slightly dazed, and Caleb shook his hand and said, "Welcome to the river." Owen and Miriam were married in the spring of 1878, in the same cold little church in Patience with the same slightly late minister, and Caleb stood up with Owen, and Clara stood up with Miriam, and Thomas sat in the front pew with Gerald Devane, and the old man held the child with the careful dignity of a man who has decided that whatever tenderness he never allowed himself before, he will allow himself now. The 2 ranches became, over the years that followed, something more than simply neighboring properties. They were bound together by family and friendship, and the particular intimacy of people who have built something in hard country and know the value of a neighbor you can trust. Owen expanded his herd. Miriam, predictably, had the loudest opinions in the territory about everything and was right about most of them. She and Clara argued furiously about books and agreed completely about everything important, which was the best possible configuration for sisters. Gerald Devane passed in the winter of 1879, quietly and in his sleep, which was the best end the territory offered to stubborn old men who had come west with a mule and a grudge and built 60 acres of something from nothing. He had been better for 2 years, the lung sickness never gone but managed, and his last summer he had sat on the porch of the farmhouse in the evenings with Thomas on the steps beside him, teaching the boy the names of the stars and the shapes of the clouds and the particular grammar of the Oklahoma sky, which he knew better than anyone. Caleb had stood at the farmhouse gate watching them one evening, the old man and his grandson in the last light, and felt something complete about it. He was buried on the farm he had built, under the oak that had been the biggest tree on the property when he arrived, and that was, accordingly, the tree he had built everything around. Clara and Miriam stood at his grave in the winter cold and held each other's hands and did not speak, because they were women who had learned from the same mother how to be quiet when quietness was required. Caleb stood beside Clara with his hand at her back, and Thomas, who was 2.5, and did not yet understand the shape of loss, but understood that something solemn was happening, stood very still for longer than he had ever stood still in his life. The farm passed to Clara and Miriam together, and they sold the east field to a neighboring family and kept the western portion with the house and the kitchen garden and the oak tree. Owen and Miriam moved into the farmhouse, and Clara's crate of books took up permanent residence on the shelf in the Harrow cabin, where they had always belonged. In the summer of 1880, Caleb and Clara's daughter arrived, a red-faced, auburn-haired, entirely determined person who announced herself with considerable volume and looked, Clara said, like someone who had been here before and knew exactly what she intended. They named her Ruth, for Clara's mother, and she was from the beginning a child who did what she decided and thought what she thought and laughed as loud as she wanted to, which was very loud and very often, and every time she laughed Caleb thought of the first time he had heard laughter carry across the Cimarron and stop him on a ridge in April. He told Clara that one evening, sitting on the porch with Ruth asleep inside, and Thomas running himself to exhaustion in the yard in the long summer dusk. "Ruth laughs like you," he said, "like the first time I heard you." Clara was leaning against the porch post with her coffee cup, and she looked at him with an expression that had all the warmth of all their years in it. "Are you going to tell her that story?" she said, "when she is old enough?" "I am going to tell both of them," he said, "every detail, including the part where you sat on a ridge for 3 seasons doing absolutely nothing. Including that part," he said, "because that is the most important part. That is the part where I nearly missed everything." She looked at him for a long moment in the summer evening, with Thomas running in the yard and the last light going gold above the prairie, and the Cimarron moving somewhere to the east in its old patient way. She put her coffee cup down on the railing and came to sit beside him, and he put his arm around her and she put her head against his shoulder, which was where it had been for 5 years of evenings now and which still felt, to him, like something he had been given that he had not quite expected to deserve. "You did not miss it," she said quietly. "You just took the long way." "I crossed eventually," he said. "You crossed," she agreed. "That is the part I remember." The years that followed were full in the way that good years are, not always easy, not without their difficulties, but full in the sense that mattered, of work that was honest and effort that was shared, and of coming home to a place that was genuinely home. There was a drought in the summer of 1881 that cut the grass on the west pasture down to nothing, and required Caleb and Owen to drive the combined herd north for 3 weeks to find adequate water. A brutal and dusty journey that nearly ended badly twice, and succeeded through a combination of good navigation and the kind of luck that comes to people who have put in enough work to deserve it. Clara managed the ranch in Caleb's absence with a practical intelligence that impressed everyone who witnessed it, including the 2 hands Caleb had taken on that year, young men from Arkansas who had come west following the cattle trade, and who were initially uncertain about taking orders from a woman and quickly became the opposite of uncertain. Because Clara Devane Harrow had opinions about fence management and cattle nutrition and water rights that turned out to be entirely correct and delivered in a tone that left no room for debate. When Caleb came back from the northern drive, lean and saddle-worn and deeply glad to see his own fence line, she met him at the gate with Thomas and Ruth, and the matter-of-fact warmth that was her particular way of showing that she had missed him badly which was to not say that she had missed him, but to stand very close to him while he dismounted. And then, when Thomas had been dealt with, and Ruth handed off to Miriam, who had come over with the children, to take his face in both her hands and kiss him in the front yard in the middle of the afternoon, he had said against her mouth, "I missed you." "I know," she said. "I could tell by the way you rode in." "How did I ride in?" "Fast," she said. "You have always been in a hurry when it matters." Except, he noted, when he was not. When he had sat on a ridge for 3 seasons with his coffee and his longing and his excellent reasons for not crossing. He said this to her and she laughed, and the laugh was exactly the laugh that had stopped him on the ridge in 1874, open and unguarded and so alive, and he kissed her again for the pure joy of the sound of it. By 1883, Thomas was 6 and Ruth was 3, and the Harrow ranch had grown to nearly 100 head, and Caleb had put in a second barn and hired 2 permanent hands, the Arkansas brothers whose names were Sam and Dill, who had turned out to be useful and loyal, and who were now as much a part of the ranch as the fence posts. Owen Briggs's operation had grown similarly, and the 2 ranches together represented one of the more successful small cattle operations in the Oklahoma Territory, which was saying something in a decade when the territory was opening up and changing, and the old quiet of the frontier was giving way to something louder and faster. The changes that came to the territory in those years were not all of them good ones. The land that had been Indian Territory was under increasing pressure from settlement, the federal government making and breaking agreements with the same uncomfortable regularity that had characterized its dealing with the Comanche and Kiowa and Cherokee and every other nation before them. Caleb watched this with the discomfort of a man who knew that his own presence on the land was part of the history he was uncomfortable with, and he said as much to Clara one evening when the news coming out of the territorial office in Guthrie was particularly bleak. Clara did not offer him easy comfort on this. She was not a woman who offered easy comfort when the truth was harder and more important. She said that the discomfort he felt was right, and that it was not sufficient but that it was something, and that the best he could do was to treat the people around him, whatever their history or their nation, with the same honest respect he would want for himself, and that this did not fix the injustice, but that it was the work of an ordinary man living in a complicated time, and ordinary men living in complicated times were all they had ever had. He thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about it the way he thought about things he could not fully resolve, not with satisfaction, but with the kind of ongoing attention that a thing deserves when it does not have a clean answer. The Harrow cabin had been expanded twice by 1884, with a proper sitting room off the main room and 2 additional sleeping rooms, so that Thomas and Ruth each had their own space, which at the ages of 7 and 4 they respectively used and absolutely refused to stay in, because Thomas wanted to be wherever his father was and Ruth wanted to be wherever there was the most happening, which was usually wherever her mother was. Clara had begun to teach Thomas his letters and numbers at the kitchen table with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to everything, and Ruth sat beside her brother at the table, attempting the same lessons 3 years ahead of any reasonable expectation, which she achieved by refusing to accept that she could not. By the time Ruth was 5, she could read the simplest of the books from her grandmother's crate, and she carried them around the ranch with the possessive tenderness of a person who has discovered something magnificent. Caleb watched his daughter walk through the kitchen garden one evening with a book under her arm and a flower in her hair that she had put there herself, and no one had suggested, and he felt the particular, wordless, overwhelming gratitude of a man who knows he is standing inside the life he almost did not choose to build. He went in and found Clara at the kitchen table with her accounts, the farm ledgers open and her pen moving in swift, careful columns, and he stood in the doorway and looked at her. She looked up and found him looking and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She looked at him for a moment with the warm, steady gaze that was one of the things he loved most about her, that quality of full attention, of being genuinely and completely looked at. "Caleb Harrow," she said. "Clara Harrow," he said. "Sit down. I need your help with the feed costs for October." He sat down and they worked through the feed costs together, her pen moving and his memory for figures doing the work it did. And outside through the window the Oklahoma prairie went gold in the evening light, and the Cimarron moved somewhere to the east, and the children's voices came from the yard. Thomas's steady commentary on something and Ruth's high bright interruptions. And the fire in the new stone fireplace made its comfortable sound, and the lamp on the table made its light. And it was not a dramatic moment or a beautiful one in any formal sense. It was simply the evening, and it was theirs. In the spring of 1885, Caleb rode out to the eastern ridge for the first time in years, not with intention, but because he had been checking the fence along the eastern pasture, and found himself at the familiar high point above the Cimarron almost without noticing the direction his horse had taken. He stopped and looked out at the river below him, low in the late April warm, running clear and quick over the stones at the bend. The far bank was exactly as it had always been, the willows coming green, the flat stone at the pool where he had first sat beside her, the path up to the Devane farmhouse visible between the trees. He sat there for a few minutes in the morning quiet with the spring air new and cool and the hawk making his circles. Then he heard hoofbeats behind him, and turned, and Clara came up the ridge on her gray mare with her hair loose, and her riding coat open and Thomas behind her on his pony, the boy doing the thing he had been doing since he could ride, which was going slightly faster than was entirely safe, and looking absolutely correct doing it. She pulled up beside him and looked out at the river. "I thought I would find you here," she said. "I was checking the east fence," he said. "You were checking the east fence," she agreed, with a tone that put quotation marks around each word. Thomas pulled his pony up on Caleb's other side and looked out at the river with the interested concentration of a 7-year-old encountering something for the first time. "Is that the Cimarron?" he said. "It is," Caleb said. "Is that the far bank, where Mama's farm was, where Grandfather's farm was?" "Yes." Thomas looked at the river and then at his father with the combination of directness and perception that he had inherited from his mother's side of the family. "Is this where you watched her from?" he said. Caleb looked at his son, then at his wife, who was looking out at the river with a small private smile and making no effort to intervene. "Yes," he said. "This is where I watched from." Thomas considered this with the gravity appropriate to the information. "And then you crossed," he said. "And then I crossed," Caleb said. Thomas looked at the river for another moment. He was a child who thought before he spoke, unlike his sister, and the pause before he said the next thing was characteristically measured. "Why did you wait so long?" he said. Caleb looked at the Cimarron below him, at the clear water and the green willows and the flat stone at the pool and the path between the trees. He thought about the answer, the real one, not the simplified version he might give a child. Then he decided that Thomas was 7 and sharp and that he could handle something close to the truth. "I was afraid," he said. Thomas looked at him with Clara's eyes, amber-flecked and entirely attentive. "Of the river. Of getting to the other side," Caleb said, "and not being enough." Thomas thought about this. Then he looked at his mother. "Was he enough?" he said. Clara turned from the river and looked at her husband, and in her face was everything, all 11 years of everything, and she answered their son without taking her eyes from Caleb. "He was more than enough," she said. "He always was. He just had to cross to find out." Thomas accepted this with the nod of someone adding information to an existing framework, and then he turned his pony and said he was going to ride down to the ford, and Caleb said not too fast, and the boy went at exactly the pace he always went, which was fast enough to require faith. Caleb and Clara sat on the ridge in the spring morning with the Cimarron below them and the prairie spreading out in every direction, green with new grass under the wide Oklahoma sky, and she reached over without looking at him and took his hand the way she had first taken it on the flat stone 11 years ago, light and sure and certain. "Come on," she said. "Where?" "Down to the river." She glanced at him with that smile. "We should make sure Thomas does not do anything heroic at the ford." He looked at her. "And after that," she squeezed his hand. "After that we go home," she said, "the same as always." He turned Della toward the ridge path and they rode down together toward the Cimarron, toward the sun at the ford and the river in spring and the east bank where it had all begun. And behind them the prairie stretched out wide and endless and sunlit. And ahead of them the water caught the light and threw it back. And the crossing, when they made it, was easy because it always had been, because it had always only ever been a river. They went home through the Cimarron in the bright April morning, the water cold around their horses' legs and the light on everything. And on the west bank, Caleb pulled Della up for a moment and looked back at the eastern ridge, at the high point where he had stood for 3 seasons with his coffee and his longing and his excellent reasons for staying put. And he thought about the man who had stood there, young and afraid and full of a love he did not yet know what to do with. And he felt for that man something like tenderness. He had crossed eventually. He had crossed and found her on the flat stone with the crying red around her eyes and the washboard in the pool, and she had said, "You are from the other side." And he had said yes, and none of the 3 seasons of watching and waiting had been necessary, which meant that all of it had been, in the way that all the long ways are necessary because they are the only ways you know until you find the crossing. Clara pulled up beside him and followed his gaze to the ridge. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said quietly, "What are you thinking?" "That it was a long time to wait," he said. She looked at the ridge. "Do you regret it?" He turned and looked at her, at his wife in the April morning with her hair loose and her gray mare patient beneath her and 11 years of their life between them. "No," he said, "because it was the waiting that made the crossing what it was." She held his gaze with those remarkable eyes, those amber-flecked dark eyes that had been looking at him with full attention since the first morning he had found the courage to come around the bend and sit beside her on a flat stone. "That," she said, "is the first philosophical thing you have ever said to me." "I have been thinking about it for 11 years, he said. "I wanted to get it right." She laughed, and the laugh went out across the Cimarron and the west bank and the morning prairie, open and unguarded and entirely alive, exactly the way it had sounded from the ridge in April of 1874 when he had stopped his horse without knowing why. And it was still the most beautiful sound in the world, and he was still on the right side of everything to hear it. Thomas called from ahead of them on the bank, waving impatiently in the way of 7-year-olds who have been patient for approximately as long as 7-year-olds can manage, and Caleb and Clara put their horses forward and rode toward their son, and toward the ranch, and toward the life they had built from one crossing and everything that came after it. The west bank was waiting for them, as it always was. The cabin was warm and the fire would need building up and Ruth would need feeding and the accounts were not finished, and the south fence had a post that needed resetting before the next wet season, and there was always something, and every something was exactly where Caleb Harrow wanted to be. He had crossed the river. He had everything.